Welcome to Wikipodcast. Today we're focusing on something that affects millions, often unseen, post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD.
That's right. It's carried internally, those invisible scars of the mind we're exploring today as part of our look into trauma and psychology.
We're going to really dig into PTSD from that psychological viewpoint.
Looking at causes, symptoms, and, importantly, the treatments and management strategies the psychology offers.
Our mission really is to give you a clear picture of what PTSD is, what it can look like, and how it's approached without, getting bogged down in too much jargon.
Exactly, a helpful overview.
So let's start at the beginning. Psychologically speaking, what is PTSD?
Okay, so at its core, PTSD is classified as a mental health condition. It can develop after someone goes through or even witnesses an event that they find deeply traumatic.
Right, and traumatic events. That covers a lot of ground, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A really wide spectrum. We're talking about things like sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse, but also warfare, natural disasters, serious accidents. Basically, any situation that involves a real threat to life or well-being.
It's quite sobering when you list them like that. The range of human experiences that could lead here.
It is. And the way it affects people, the psychological impact, that's just as varied.
How does that usually manifest? What are the common symptoms people might notice?
Well, there's a cluster of symptoms we look for. One major one is re-experiencing the trauma. So intrusive thoughts, vivid flashbacks like they're happening again, nightmares.
That sounds incredibly distressing.
It is, and people can also experience intense emotional distress or even physical reactions, like a racing heart, when they encounter reminders, cues related to the event.
Which leads to avoidance, I suppose.
Exactly. That's another key symptom cluster, making efforts to avoid anything that brings the trauma back. That could be, specific places, people, activities, even trying to shut down thoughts or feelings connected to it.
Right, pushing it away.
Yeah. And then there are often negative changes in thinking and mood, like persistent negative beliefs about oneself or the world, feeling detached, loss of interest in things they used to enjoy. And finally, there's often a significant change in arousal and reactivity, that heightened fight or flight response we talked about.
Being constantly on edge.
Yes. Feeling jumpy, easily startled, being hypervigilant, maybe having angry outbursts or difficulty sleeping. It's like the body's alarm system is just stuck on high alert.
And for it to be PTSD, these things need to stick around for a while.
That's a critical point.
Yeah.
The diagnostic criteria specify that these symptoms must last for more than a month.
Okay. And I think we found mentions that triggers can sometimes be quite specific, even seemingly unrelated things like certain sounds and misophonia, for example.
Yes, triggers can be very individual and sometimes unexpected. And interestingly, with young children, the trauma might not show up as obvious distress.
How so?
They might express their memories or feelings about the event through their play. It's a different way of processing, but the impact is still there.
Now, something that really stood out from our research, and it feels vital to stress this, most people who go through something traumatic don't develop PTSD.
Absolutely crucial. Resilience is, thankfully, very common. It's not an automatic consequence of trauma.
But the type of trauma does seem to matter in terms of risk.
It does appear so. The evidence suggests that experiencing interpersonal violence, so trauma inflicted deliberately by another person, carries a higher risk than, say, non-assault-based traumas like accidents or disasters.
There's something particularly damaging about harm coming from another human.
It seems that way. And, PTSD often doesn't travel alone, psychologically speaking.
Right. Co-occurring conditions are common.
Very common. We often see it alongside depression, other anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and substance use disorders, quite frequent too. Some of this is a way of coping, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And in kids, besides emotional regulation difficulties, things like tinnitus have even been associated with it. It really shows how widespread the effects can be.
So that brings us to risk factors. Why do some people develop PTSD when others don't, even after similar events?
That's the million-dollar question, partly. But we do know some factors increase vulnerability. Certain occupations, for instance.
Like first responders.
Military. Exactly. People routinely exposed to violence, disaster, intense stress. Military personnel, police, firefighters, paramedics, emergency healthcare workers. That cumulative exposure takes a toll.
Makes sense.
The nature of the event itself is also key.
Yeah.
Intensity matters. Witnessing death, torture, those are particularly high-risk experiences. Unexpected events or situations where someone felt completely trapped, unable to escape, also seem to increase vulnerability.
And you mentioned interpersonal traumas again.
Yes, things like physical abuse, assault, kidnapping. They consistently show up as strong risk factors.
And there was an interesting point about gender differences, too.
Yes.
Like-
Statistically, while men might experience more traumatic events overall in a lifetime, women are actually more likely to develop PTSD following certain types of trauma, particularly interpersonal violence and sexual assault.
That's a really important distinction.
It is. And with intimate partner violence or sexual assault, factors like feeling trapped or fearing for one's life during the event really elevate the risk of persistent symptoms.
Wow. Even how others react afterwards can play a role.
Sadly, yes.
Hmm.
Being blamed or dismissed can significantly hinder recovery.
War is obviously a huge factor, too.
Immense. Rates of PTSD are very high among refugees and military veterans. And it's worth noting, for some military personnel, the onset can be delayed. Symptoms might not fully emerge until months or even years after their service ends.
A delayed fuse, almost.
Kind of. Another common, though often overlooked trigger is the unexpected death of a loved one.
That's considered a potential PTSD trigger.
It can be. While most people navigate grief and adapt over time, for some, the sudden, shocking nature of the loss can lead to PTSD symptoms.
And serious illness, too.
Yes. Experiences like surviving cancer, a heart attack, a stroke, or even a traumatic stay in an ICU. Also, pregnancy-related trauma, things like miscarriage or emergency childbirth. Even surviving a psychotic episode can put someone at higher risk.
It really broadens the scope of what we might typically think of as trauma.
It does. It highlights that intensely stressful, frightening experiences, whatever their source, can have these lasting psychological effects.
And genetics.
Yeah.
Is there a biological component?
There seems to be. Research suggests genetics can play a role in susceptibility. Some people might be genetically more resilient, others perhaps more vulnerable when faced with trauma.
Okay, so it's a complex mix of experience, context, and biology. Given all that, how does psychology approach helping people? What are the main treatments?
Well, the cornerstone of treatment is usually psychotherapy, talk therapy, or counseling.
Right.
And there are several specific types with strong evidence supporting them for PTSD.
Like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy.
Exactly. CBT is a big one. It helps people identify and challenge those negative thought patterns and beliefs that often develop after trauma.
How does that work specifically for trauma?
There's trauma-focused CBT, which directly addresses the traumatic memories and feelings in a safe, structured environment. Another related type is prolonged exposure therapy.
Prolonged exposure sounds intense.
It involves carefully, gradually revisiting the trauma memories and situations that the person has been avoiding. The idea is that facing them in a controlled way with support helps reduce the fear and avoidance associated with them over time.
Okay, desensitization through exposure. What about EMDR? That's one people hear about too. Eye movement desensitization reprocessing.
Yes, EMDR. That involves focusing on the traumatic memory while doing bilateral stimulation, often guided eye movements, but sometimes taps or sounds.
The theory is.
The theory, essentially, is that this helps the brain reprocess the memory so it becomes less emotionally charged, less disruptive. It helps integrate it rather than having it stuck, if you like.
Interesting. Any other main therapy types?
Interpersonal psychotherapy, or IPT, is also used. It focuses more on improving relationships and social functioning, which can be really impacted by PTSD.
Makes sense. Trauma can be very isolating. Is medication used much?
It can be part of the picture for some. Certain antidepressants, especially SSRIs and SNRIs, can be moderately helpful, particularly for managing those co-occurring symptoms like anxiety or depression.
But not all meds are helpful.
Right. It's generally agreed that benzodiazepines tranquilizers aren't recommended for long-term PTSD treatment. They might offer short-term relief, but can actually hinder recovery and carry risks of dependence.
Good to know. Any other approaches mentioned?
Well, sometimes medication like prazosin is used specifically to help reduce nightmares. And the positive role of physical exercise in managing stress and improving overall well-being is often highlighted.
And for kids? You mentioned play therapy earlier.
Yes, play therapy is a really important tool for helping children process traumatic experiences in a way that's appropriate for their developmental stage.
It's useful, too, to just briefly touch on the history. This isn't a new phenomenon, even if the label is relatively recent.
Not at all. Think of terms like shell shock from World War I or combat neurosis. They reflect earlier attempts to understand the psychological impact of extreme stress and trauma.
Right.
The actual term post-traumatic stress disorder really came into wider use in the 1970s, largely linked to the experiences of Vietnam War veterans, and then it was officially added to the diagnostic manuals in 1980.
So our understanding has evolved.
Definitely.
Oh.
It shows this ongoing effort to recognize and address the deep psychological wounds that trauma can inflict.
So wrapping this up, PTSD is clearly a complex condition. It stems from a huge range of possible experiences, shows up in diverse ways, and really affects people's lives.
Deeply.
But the key takeaways seem to be, trauma is sadly common, but PTSD is not inevitable. And importantly, there are effective psychological treatments available.
That's right. Help is available, and recovery is possible. Understanding the psychology behind it is a huge part of that journey, both for individuals and for those supporting them. It fosters empathy and points towards pathways for healing.
Thanks for listening. Write us your opinion in the comments on what aspects of recovering from trauma do you find most challenging to understand. Subscribe to the channel to help more listeners reach our episodes. Thank you and have an amazing day.